This is the story of the greatest art theft of all time, and why ancient Egypt's most priceless artifact has been in Germany for over 100 years now. The iconic 3,000-year-old bust of Queen Nefertiti is still captivating European audiences with its timeless beauty, but did Germany steal it from Egypt? If so, why haven't they given it back yet? And is it really safer to keep it here? The answers are mired by more drama and conspiracy than the life of the Queen herself, with everyone from Hitler to Beyonce pouring fuel on the fire of the Nefertiti controversy. The bust has been found irresistible since the moment it was taken out of the sands. With archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt recording in his diary, suddenly we had in our hands the most alive Egyptian artwork. You cannot describe it with words. You must see it, as he recalled the moment that it was found by Mohammed S. Sanusi, one of a huge team of Egyptians working on a German-funded excavation in 1912. This was a time of great Egypt mania, with European powers competing to see who could fill their museums with the most ancient wonders, and Borchardt was clearly the first who would fall for Nefertiti's spellbinding, era-defying gaze. As we'll find out, some would argue that he was the first in a long line of people who would steal her, a line that reaches right up to the present day. But how did he get her to Berlin? Well, depends who you ask. But the crucial fact underpinning every version of events is this. At that time, there was no free and independent nation of Egypt. In fact, while most of the world was busy being ruined by either British or French occupation, Egypt had the rare misfortune of trying to deal with both at once, all while still technically being under the control of the Ottoman Empire as well. The colonial powers imposed a law dictating that all archaeological finds would be split 50-50 between Egypt and whichever country had financed the dig. Which meant that on this day, when he first held it, Borchardt knew that all he had to do to claim it as a prestige piece for his home country was find a way to get it into Germany's half. To understand how he did that, it's important that we know what else he knew when he first laid eyes on her. Nefertiti's name means the beautiful one has arrived, something that everybody who's been to see her in Berlin can vouch for. I mean, standing in front of her is really quite something. She doesn't even need to have both pupils in place to give you the impression that you're making eye contact with the past. So little is known about Nefertiti's background, but it's believed that she rose from a normal family, possibly even outside of Egypt, to marry the pharaoh Akhenaten when she was 15. The royal couple rejected Egypt's traditional family of gods and founded a new religion centered around the one god Aten, a seriously radical step that marked one of the world's earliest experiments with monotheism. They even moved their regime to a brand new city, Amarna, built further down the Nile and dedicated to them and their contact with divinity. But the most unique feature of their art is that Nefertiti is depicted as equal to her husband, equal in height, equal in theological importance, even equally fierce and noble in battle scenes. Such depictions of women in that era are astonishingly rare, which is how we know that Nefertiti was an immensely significant figure. She died, leaving behind 6 daughters, one of whom may or may not have married Tutankhamun, and after her husband may or may not have been murdered, the records really aren't clear, their Aten cult was no more, with ancient Egypt readopting its multiple gods and their new city being abandoned to the winds and the sands forever. Sands which covered up and virtually perfectly preserved this bust for over 3,000 years, until it was discovered in the ruins of what had been the workshop of an ancient Egyptian sculptor. And there's a section on that Amarna period in Berlin today, where you'll see plenty of Nefertiti and her husband. But all that does is demonstrate the fact that if you had had a long archaeological career digging up things like this, and sending them to museums, and then you suddenly see this, there is no way that you could not know that you are holding the most priceless find, at least since the Rosetta Stone, and maybe of all time. So bearing in mind that Borchardt knew that, how did he get this treasure into Germany's half of the spoils? Well, the allocations did have to be approved by the Antiquities Department, but this was run by, you guessed it, not the Egyptians, but our friends, the French, which left the whole system wide open to theft and abuse. According to the most common theory, Borchardt deliberately played down the importance of the bust to get it into Germany's half, with evidence suggesting that he had deceitfully entered it into the manifest as simply a gypsum bust of a princess. Some even accuse him of covering it with dirt and leaving it in an old box of bones and loose artifacts over to the side, hoping that the inspectors wouldn't think twice to look at what was in there. But in 2009, a German newspaper claimed to have unearthed documents that proved that the authorities never even saw this haul in person. reason, and instead relied on photographs taken by Borchardt in which he deliberately displayed the bust not in the best light because he wanted to save it for us. Us as in Germany. A memo from the British Museum even described the bust's allocation to Germany as only explicable on the grounds of gross favouritism, incompetence, or corruption, which really should be your first red flag. When the British Museum calls you out for stealing something, you know you've gone too far. See, I will show some self-awareness of my own home country in this video, which, by the way, has to be worth a like and a subscribe. Thank you very much. There is, of course, also the official line that everything happened by the book, and hey, some cool stuff must have stayed behind in Egypt's half too, and since the moment the allocation was signed off, no backsies. Even if you grant that, given that the whole 50-50 law was imposed by foreign powers anyway, some would say that that still constitutes brazen theft, as Egypt itself never approved of the bust leaving. But as we'll see when we look into the ongoing battle over whether it should be given back or not, some people are still leaning on the argument that everything happened legally, among other, more questionable viewpoints. Interestingly, when the bust first arrived in Germany, it didn't go straight onto public display. Borchardt saw to it that it went straight into the private collection of the dig's main benefactor, James Simon, a renowned investor and art patron who still has galleries named after him in Berlin today. After 8 years of flexing the Queen on his mantelpiece, Simon voluntarily donated her to the Berlin Museum in 1920, where she was an instant sensation, becoming Berlin's newest celebrity overnight. And the Nefertiti genie has been out of the bottle ever since. Despite being conveniently secured before the First World War, Nefertiti's public appearance after Germany's loss was a much-needed source of pride. She was a new icon for New Berlin, its answer to how the Mona Lisa was drawing wealthy elites to Paris. Any full-colour sculpture from this long ago that was this well preserved would have been the best Egyptian artefact in Europe by a mile anyway, especially considering that Tutankhamun's tomb is only just being discovered at this time and his mask won't be exhibited in Europe for another 50 years. But what's striking about the bust of Nefertiti is the way that her thin neck, high cheekbones, full lips and symmetrical face seem to appeal to modern beauty standards. It's a face that's totally out of place in time. In a world where fashions are changing so quickly, how could it be that one single representation of beauty is worshipped by citizens of ancient Egypt in 1400 BC and also draws immediate comparison to the new goddesses of the 1920s like Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich and Louise Brooks? Well, 10 years later, Germany had a new party in power who thought that they had all the answers. To those who could twist just about anything to suit their occult fantasies, the bust of Nefertiti was proof that all achievements of ancient Africa were really attributable to their Aryan master race after all, and that pure Nordic blood really was the only path to beauty, power, and divinity. I won't patronize you by breaking down what's wrong with that theory. When Simon donated the bust in the first place, he stipulated that if Egypt ever asked, they should be allowed to exhibit it themselves instead. And with Egypt finally gaining its independence, the official request did come. Both Simon and the museum consented to sending it back, in a plan that was even endorsed by high-ranking Nazi officials like Goebbels and Goering, who saw the opportunity for Nazi Germany to score some points on the international relations front, and especially to be the hero in a story in which Britain and France had been the villains. So Nefertiti was this close to going home, until Hitler himself stepped in and vetoed the plan, unconcerned with any gentleman's agreements made by Simon, who was Jewish. "I will never relinquish the head of the Queen," Hitler said. "It is a masterpiece," as he moved to keep Nefertiti hostage in Berlin forever, before proceeding to go and start a war that needed her to be moved out of Berlin for a while. The bust was wrapped up and first transferred to the cellar of a bank for safekeeping, and then into a salt mine in central Germany that acted as a repository for irreplaceable paintings by various masters and, of course, a healthy dose of Nazi gold. After Germany had lost that war too, our queen again narrowly missed out on a ride back home. When American soldiers located the stash containing the bust, Egypt once more asked for it back. But the Allies said that their remit was only to address war-era looting. Anything the Nazis had stolen would be returned to its original owner before the war, and this artwork's owner before the war was a museum in Berlin, so that's where it was sent back to. Nefertiti has since been used as a pro-feminism symbol of women in power in both the 1960s counterculture and during Arab Spring protests, and has been portrayed largely questionably in various movies and TV shows. She's even been drawn into the immigration politics of the multicultural reunified Berlin of the 90s and noughties, including with this ad from a newspaper joking, "The most beautiful resident is a foreigner? That's so Berlin." To the Merkel government, the bust's presence certified Berlin as the world's leading preserver of cultural heritage, with Nefertiti even being described as Egypt's greatest ambassador, promoting the country to German audiences without ever drawing a salary, a view that Egyptian administrations have taken to be quite insulting. Beyonce's appearance at Coachella 2018, casting herself as Nefertiti to represent feminine power, and her associated merch release, saw her take some heat for commercializing a culture that wasn't her own, with critics saying that trying to connect a figure from ancient Egypt with modern symbols of the African-American fight for equality like the Black Panther is quite a stretch, while the more charitable interpretation would be that it's her right to celebrate culture from all over Africa and the world, and it's just a fun way for one queen to pay tribute to another that came before her. Never mind the fact that artists make even bigger stretches all the time, like her husband casting himself as actual God. But Beyonce had truly ignited the debate like nobody else could. After an exhibition in the Netherlands showcased all the instances of black musicians referencing ancient Egypt, featuring not just Beyonce but everybody from Miles Davis and Nina Simone to Nas and Rihanna, Egypt retaliated by banning Dutch archaeologists from digging there, claiming that drawing any link between the two worlds is an attempt to falsify history. Arguably just demonstrating once again how little agency Egypt really has to take back control over how its historical icons are used once they're exported. But hold on, so one thing that has stayed the same since it was made over 3.5 millennia ago, before all of these concepts even existed, somehow means all of these conflicting things? How can it all possibly be true? Well, us knowing so little about Nefertiti's heritage, ethnicity, and in particular how she ruled, has left plenty of room for imagination and myth to fill in the gaps. But we do know that it was so different from even the modern Egyptian state, let alone America's 90s hip-hop scene, that some people disagree with invoking her that far from her original context. You could argue that she hasn't just been stolen once, she's continually being stolen again and again, co-opted into representing whatever's convenient for whoever's shouting loudest. But on the other hand, what is art for? If you see art as a lightning rod for ideas and discussions and an attempt to elicit a reaction in an audience, then you could look at how this bust has done that for more distinct audiences across a wider time frame than anything else ever, and argue that this is the greatest work of art of all time. And if you agree with that theory, maybe you also sympathize with Egypt wanting it back. It's drawing well over 500,000 visitors to Berlin every year, with an entrance fee of around €14 when I went. And of course, I loved going because it's an incredible thing to see and I have the privilege of living near to it, but should it really be like that? If repatriated and presented closer to her original context as the centerpiece of a new Amana museum, it could allow more actual Egyptians to see her, as well as diversifying tourism away from Cairo, and maybe even directly funding more research into her reign in the area. Sounds great, no? So why don't they give it back?
Also die Gültigkeit ist nach dem jeweiligen Rechtssystem der damaligen Zeit adäquat gewesen.
That's the company line, as presented by the museum's director, Frederica Zeyfried, as she says that all laws of the day were followed when removing the bust from Egypt. As we've seen, this version of events is contested. But say we take it as true that taking Nefertiti was legal. Is everything that's legal also, therefore, ethical? If we say yes, then we've outthought every philosopher ever by finally discovering the secret to objective morality. Everything is moral, as long as I write it down first. But worse than that, and more seriously, how did the laws get like that in the first place? I mean, they weren't even written by Egypt, they were imposed by force. So unless you think that might makes right, you also have a problem there. And consider whether or not an independent Greece or Italy voluntarily give away half of the things that they find when digging for Greek or Roman artifacts. But of course, as in every debate that doesn't have a clear answer, the opposite argument to all of these things is also true. The past is a foreign country and they do things differently there, and it's not always useful to wait until the moral landscape shifts and then start judging things. But then again, aren't we glad that society progresses? Look, maybe what makes this theft into a remarkable opportunity is that unlike most sins of the past, you can actually fix it. You can just send it back. Right? Well...
Dass sie tatsächlich zu fragil ist für den Transport. So muss ich von kuratorischer Seite sagen, ich bewege dieses Objekt nicht.
That's the claim that it's too fragile to move, and I mean, it does make you think. The bust made it from the Amarna site to a mantelpiece in Berlin to a museum, suddenly to a salt mine hundreds of miles away, probably in the sidecar of some Nazi motorbike on 1930s roads, and then back again in an American truck, and even moved between museums in the modern era, and seems to have survived all of that perfectly fine. Or, depending on your personal interpretation, maybe you see that as a reason to draw a line now and start to be extra careful. Another common claim is that artifacts are safer in Germany. Egypt has definitely had some notable cases of break-ins and damage before, but so has Berlin, with vandals even damaging Egyptian artifacts in this exact museum in 2020. So like most of these arguments, those in favour of repatriation question whether using that as leverage to keep the bust in Berlin isn't just another case of those who live north of the Mediterranean thinking that they can patronise and make decisions for those who live south of it. The bust already had to be evacuated from war on German soil once anyway, saving her from a museum that was so badly damaged in bomber raids that it didn't have its big post-war reopening until 2009, so it could be seen as a little rich to declare any one city objectively eternally safer than any other. But with the trenches of the Nefertiti debate dug pretty deeply at this point, here stands the Queen for the foreseeable future, alone in this room in a foreign country, night and day. Divinely beloved in her own era, in our era, and probably also in every era that's to come.